Hello and welcome to the Lively Faith Podcast. I am your host, the Reverend Nathan Stomberg, Rector of Holy Communion Anglican Church in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. And today I'm joined by the Reverend Mark Galloway, Presbyter at Holy Communion, and we're also joined by Cory DuPont, Subdeacon at St. Mary Antiochian Orthodox Church in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And before we get started, some quick housekeeping. First, I'm overjoyed to share that at the time of this recording, we have received over 2,000 combined listens and views with over 500 unique listeners. Praise God. That is incredible. And thank you, our dear listeners, for your support, and thank God for his blessings.
It's awesome. It's Cory. He's dragging them in.
It's definitely Cory. With that beard,
yes,
it will never be steered wrong.
It is.
That said, we do know, dear listener, that most of you have not subscribed, and so we firmly but lovingly encourage you. We can't tell you what to do, but we encourage you to hit that subscribe button or follow button wherever you watch or listen. We appreciate your support as always, and we thank you for your continued prayers. So, without further ado, let's get started. We've got a great conversation for us today. We're going to be talking all about Eastern Orthodoxy, and for anyone who's watching online, you'll see that our co-host Cory here is wearing a cassock today, and I think that's maybe a good place to start, Cory. What is up with the cassock? Why wear the cassock in your tradition? And also explain the position of subdeacon. I think that's maybe a good place to start, right? We know that you're part of the Orthodox faith, and I think for many, if not most, in the Western or Latin traditions, it's something of an enigma, and we've touched upon that in episodes past. And so what we'd really like to do is clear up a lot of that mystery around the Orthodox tradition for us. And so we'll jump into that general Q&A. So would you care to speak a little bit to the choice of cassock and the role that plays in tradition and witness and the liturgy of the Orthodox tradition?
Sure. There's no real exact history necessarily of the cassock or what's called in Greek the ritza. It's partly due to monastic use, right? Because clergy used to be trained in the monasteries. The seminaries are really Western creations. They didn't really come to the East until recent history.
Right.
And so the other interesting part about it too is it's common for anyone in holy orders or even minor orders, what are called minor orders, and the two minor orders in the church are subdeacon and reader. For example, just last Sunday we had a gentleman, young man in our parish who was tonsured, a reader. And he was given the cassock.
Would you explain what tonsure means?
Yes, tonsure, yes, I can explain that. Tonsured. Western or Latin Christians would probably be familiar with this word because it's something that is done to someone when they become a monk. When they enter a monastery or tonsured, they usually will take hair from your head. In my case, that's not going to be possible. And in fact, the young man who was tonsured, a reader last Sunday, he's bald too, but he had some facial hair, so the bishop just cut a little bit of his facial hair off and tonsured him. So, but in the Orthodox Church, anyone who undertakes any particular order will be tonsured. So a subdeacon or a reader will be tonsured before they are given that official position within the parish. Deacons and priests, of course, are not tonsured, they're ordained, right? Just like in Anglicanism or in Catholicism.
Would you be able to explain the purpose of the tonsure or the symbolism behind the taking of hair?
Yeah, the symbolism behind it would be that a part of you now is being given up slowly, right? And then the rest of your life, you'll give up more of yourself to this ministry, and usually also it's hoped that this would be a beginning to the priesthood. right? In fact, in the prayers for being tonsured for a reader, it's actually referred to as the first order of the priesthood. So,
Right, so these are the steps you're going through towards.
yes, that's exactly.
So I
correct.
think in comparison to maybe someone who goes to an evangelical or a non-denominational church, where someone in a role of like a reader or a deacon would view those as just either other separate roles or vocations within the church, this is viewed more in terms of a succession, maybe for lack of a better term.
Yes, it is.
Or a sequence.
It could be, but we also have permanent deacons as well. We do have permanent deacons. As a matter of fact, there's been a growth of the permanent diaconate in some of our jurisdictions. And by jurisdictions, I mean here in the United States, those churches that are connected to the historic patriarchates in the old countries. So you think of the ecumenical patriarch, for example, or the Patriarch of Antioch, in my case, who's my patriarch. Being a member of the Antiochian Archdiocese here in the United States, we're historically connected to the Patriarchate of Antioch. So,
Just to explain that who the four great patriarchies.
yeah. In Orthodox ecclesiology, historically, we recognize something called the pentarchy, which are the historic sees in the ancient church. So among them, first you would have the See of Rome. Then you would have the See of Constantinople, or the Ecumenical Patriarchate. You would have Antioch. You would have Jerusalem, and then Alexandria. And Jerusalem is commonly understood to be a patriarchate of honor, because it's where the church began, right? And it's the See of St. James. So, and in Orthodox understanding, after the 11th century, it's understood that Rome split from this historic ecclesiology and went its own way. And so we recognize the Pope as the Bishop of Rome, Patriarch of the West, to be sure, but among the other claims of Catholicism about his office, obviously we don't accept those. So, yeah.
Which is somewhat similar to Anglicanism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To some
Sure. Yep.
And I think just going back to diverge our train of thought a little bit there, even going back to the act of the tonsure, I think there's something really powerful about that adds a sense of gravitas to the vocation that you're pursuing, and making it known that you're doing something that is much more than just, well, you're doing another job, you're volunteering in the church.
Sure.
I think it's important for even especially lay people to take those things with the same amount of seriousness
Yeah.
as ordained people.
I mean, I guess I could compare it, you would see in some more of the, the low church Protestant traditions where they talk about, ministries in the church, right? Orthodox commonly don't think like that. If you want to do something in the church, you have to be tonsured or be ordained, right? If you want to do something in some formal capacity, particularly liturgically, which is where all the work of the church really is done anyway. It's in the context of the liturgy, right? So, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, just as a note, Nathan, the West had all the minor orders too.
Yes, that's right.
And in Roman Catholicism, we think of the three orders, bishop, priest, and deacon. But until Vatican II, all the minor orders were necessary. So if you were going to be ordained, eventually a priest, in the Roman Catholic Church, you had to go through the minor acolyte,
Right.
doorkeeper, reader,
Sure,
all
yeah.
of those things.
Yeah.
So it's not that long ago. And so Anglicanism inherited that until the Reformation, and Cranmer got rid of the minor orders and just had the three orders of deacon, presbyter, and bishop.
Thank you, Mark.
So,
Yeah.
so it's not, we're not cut off from that tradition.
Yeah.
No, not by any means.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful context to understand.
Yep.
So, go ahead, Cory.
Some people will also ask about the beards. They're always curious
I was
about
getting
the
there.
beards.
I thought you just never shaved since I met you.
Yeah, it could be that too. So I became Orthodox. It's just for hairy people. So the history behind that practice is interesting. It really has its base in the Old Testament. In fact, if you go back to Leviticus and Numbers, where there are injunctions against, one, cutting your hair, and also for males to shave. You're not supposed to shave. And it was adopted pretty much from the beginning of the church, where men would wear beards in most cases, and not cut their hair. And then sometimes people have asked me, said, well, wait a second, isn't there something in the letters of Paul that says, you should not grow your hair long and all this stuff? And Orthodox have always distinguished in that instance between laity and clergy.
Yeah.
Right? And so, sure, the laity should clean up their act a bit, but the clergy can be as hairy as they want.
It's fascinating when you look at ancient art.
Sure.
In both in the East and the West, and certainly in the iconography.
Yeah.
Clergy always had beards.
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
Even if you look at all the early popes have beards.
Yeah.
And all the later expressions of paintings of them.
It's interesting because the early Middle Ages is where you start to see a change in that, right? And there's actually an instance where when the mutual excommunications took place between Cardinal Humbert, representing the papacy in the 11th century, and then the Ecumenical Patriarchate. One of the criticisms that Cardinal Humbert had of Eastern clergy is that they continued to grow their beards and grow their hair, and they weren't looking like their brother Latin clergy in the West, who were shorn and clean and whatnot by that point. Which is interesting because the Latin clergy ended up going back to the pre-Christian Roman practice of being clean-shaven. I mean, you can look at the art, for example, the Republican era of Rome, and men are clean-shaven, and their hair is shorn and whatnot, They didn't look like the ancient Greeks. The Greeks were hairy people. So it's interesting how far back that goes, even before Christianity. But it became fairly common after World War I, for example, as the Orthodox Church was coming into the West, for a lot of clergy to begin to trim their beards, if just not grow them at all, and they would just shave, right? And they keep their hair short. My priest, for example, he doesn't really have a beard. He's got some scruff, and he keeps his hair very short. Most clergy I know have short hair. I don't see long hair unless I go to one of the monasteries, and their beards are obviously very long, and they have the long hair. So
ultimately, the Catholic, clericals, are about identification.
Sure. Yeah.
It identifies us to the world who we are.
Right.
I've spoken about this in our context many times. It's not about being better than our evangelical brethren or anybody else in the Christian fold that doesn't have the tradition of wearing clerical identification. But it certainly is a bigger challenge when you have to live your daily life in public in clericals than if you're not. You can't hide.
Yeah.
You can't hide. And Christians shouldn't be hiding from giving the testimony that's in us.
Right.
And so there's a lot of biblical power to wearing the cassock or wearing clericals.
Yeah, and it fosters in you the desire to be more responsible.
Well, the need to be.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. You just can't walk around in this thing and continue to behave the way, that you used to.
Doofus,
Right? You have to watch what you say. You have to be sober-minded. And
you have to be more like the Good Samaritan, don't you?
Yeah, you absolutely do. You absolutely do. So it has practical use as well. Although it is a pain in the butt to walk upstairs.
I imagine.
And I almost tripped coming in here.
Not to keep, but so for generations in England, Anglicans would have worn a cassock.
Yeah.
That would have been all the way up until the 50s with the short, what do they call them? They only came up to the knees.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the waistcoats.
The waistcoats.
Yeah, right.
And cassocks would have been standard.
Yes.
And also, in the Anglican tradition, we think of bishops wearing purple, and that's not even 100 years old, that tradition. So before the turn of the 20th century, you never saw an Anglican bishop in purple or the violet, whatever now. They would have been in black. And so things that modern people think go back centuries don't, or even to antiquity, is not true.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, the cassock was just a standard part of Anglicanism from the Reformation, carrying over from the medieval Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And I've understood as well that the clerical collar itself, or
Originates-
the suit, it's written to the Presbyterians in the 19th century in Scotland. I understand. So
Originates? you said?
that's what I've heard anyway.
Maybe. Yeah, it's actually, in England, it started before tab collars were worn. Collars were worn by Anglicans before Romans. And it was a turning around of the collar.
Sure.
You know, how the end, how our lacked the tab collars, but the click collars used to be worn the opposite way by men in England. And so the tradition became the clergy were it the opposite way to be identifiable in their dress. And so in the English-speaking West, it originates with Anglicans, not with the Romans.
Yeah.
Romans just wore the cassock without a tab.
Right.
Just interesting things.
Yeah.
People would never
Something you never think about.
assume that, right?
And now it's
And it was illegal in England.
that's right. Yeah.
Unless you were a member of the established church to wear clerical. So Methodists couldn't wear them. Nobody else could wear them. Only Anglicans could wear them.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, I'm aware I don't want to turn this into a long rabbit hole because it could, but I think it's worth mentioning Anglican, Catholic, Orthodox, along with the points just mentioned about clerical dress. The other part to keep in mind is that it is not intended to be a matter of personal expression of the priest or the clergy, which clearly it has been distorted into with all sorts of different colors and adornments. I'm sure you both could think of many, many examples that you've seen in your time, but which ultimately just result in distractions and are only matters of pride.
It's about drawing attention to yourself with all your colors on. It's absurd. You're supposed to blend into no one clergyman's more distinguishable from the other.
Yeah.
It's the same reason why you wear vestments in worship. It's so that you represent the common priesthood, the ordained, not, you don't pick out what you want to wear so that you look better than somebody else down the road.
Right.
It's just total distortion that we have in contemporary, especially traditions that have borrowed liturgical practices of the historic church. It's pretty gross.
Yes, it's not the most attractive thing. I mean, in Orthodoxy, it's pretty streamlined. Cassocks are black. Sometimes they might be like a dark blue or white. White is common, for example, depending upon your rank in the priesthood. You might wear white on occasion, but otherwise, and there's some variations aesthetically between Greek cassocks and Slavonic or Russian cassocks, where the neck is more opened in a Greek cassock, and you can see under it, whereas the Slavonic covers the whole neck. Like I'm wearing for it now, it's a Russian cassock, so it covers the whole neck.
Right. Yeah. A Latin cassock would be buttoned straight. Now,
correct, yes.
Anglican cassock would be to the left, the buttons would be to the left.
Yeah, if you know it, you'd be able to pick any of these guys out and say, oh, I know what he is. I can tell by what he's wearing that he's this.
Yep.
I mean, but if you don't know and, you just assume that this is just some weird
supermarket.
person walking around.
Just a weirdo.
Yeah. Just a weirdo. Or a Muslim. I've been mistaken for a Muslim.
Yes.
I have.
I can imagine.
I have a
I
beard
don't know
and-
why.
Yeah. Well, this is, the Orthodox cassock is very similar in style to Turkish robes.
Yes.
And after the Ottoman conquest of the old Byzantine Empire, it was interesting to see, Muslims wearing similar dress as Orthodox clergy. So, and that's when, in fact, Orthodox clergy began adopting different colors to distinguish them from the Muslims. So, yeah. Yep.
One more thought on the beards as it comes to mind. Well, two more thoughts. I think first, that probably officially precludes me from joining the Orthodox Church. I'm sorry if you were getting any ideas, Cory, but there's just nothing going on
I'm
here.
59, I can't grow a beard.
Yeah.
But I think it's also interesting the point that you make about the role of beards in Orthodoxy. You almost see a parallel, if you could call it that, emerging recently in other Western traditions, some really among like rad trads and Catholicism or the cage stage sort of Presbyterians.
What does that mean?
What does that mean?
Cage stage. So this is a diversion. But when you go
Showing
through
my age here.
when you go through 5-point Calvinism, you reach a point when you first convert to Calvinism, so to speak, where you go through the cage stage, where you're like caged and it's like being a mad trad, where you're like foaming at the mouth, like you got to tell everybody about double predestination. I speak in hyperbole. So
I remember when Cory was like this.
Yeah, right?
So, cage stage, not
Not
like
about Calvinism, but
either like Nicolas Cage, like losing his mind, or
right.
like Cage, like stuck in a cage.
I can see you doing a
you're
Nicolas
behind
Cage
bars.
imitation right now.
Yeah.
Like Saturday Night Live version.
Yeah.
So that's what that is. Okay. All right. Yeah, beards are in.
But
Beards are back.
beards
Yeah.
are in, not just among the jokes that I like to make, but beards are in, I think, as a reaction to the demasculinization
Yeah.
of men in the
I was just
culture.
going to say.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've always had the observation that when politicians and businessmen start growing facial hair, it's a real trend. You know, it's like
Yeah.
beards are back. Because when was the last time you saw, for example, high statesmen grow a beard?
Right.
Rutherford B. Hayes. You know what I mean? It's
Right.
right.
Yeah.
I mean,
Chastain Arthur.
most presidents used to have beards.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Grant?
Grant, Lincoln, all those guys.
Yeah.
It's very common, but it's coming back. Yeah, and that is part of the attraction, I guess, of Orthodoxy for
Yeah.
some people. It's like, not that you need to become Orthodox to grow a beard. I just tell people, well, you can grow a beard, and just grow a beard. But it's very common too for a lot of converts to Orthodoxy. They just, before they even become Orthodox, they come in with this long beard, and usually a good bishop will tell them you need to shave.
Blonde-haired,
It's a
blue-eyed
little
guy,
pretentious.
scared we're in big trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Big
I'm in
trouble.
big trouble.
You fair-skinned Irish Scottish folks are.
The recessive genes.
Right. Right.
Well, I think that's a good segue, Cory. You mentioned part of the draw of Orthodoxy. Would you be willing to share some of what drew you to the Orthodox faith?
Yeah. For me, it was the worship of the church. I was in seminary as a Protestant, and I had been reading the Fathers. I mean, you had to do that, and I found the Eastern Fathers, the Cappadocians, very interesting, and but it was not. It wasn't a heady thing for me. It really wasn't. I started to take an interest in seeing how, the other side worshipped, and said, well, I want to go to this church. I want to, see what this is like. I mean, the first church I had visited was a Greek-speaking church in Massachusetts. It was a pretty old church. It was over 100 years old. Very, very deep ethnic community. Everyone was English-speaking, of course, as their first language, but liturgically everything was in Greek. And so I didn't quite know what was going on. I mean, I'd been studying Greek in seminary, so I could pick out a few words here and there, but that was it. Other than that part in the liturgy where you would see what, as Western Christian, you call the Eucharistic canon. I said, okay, well, I know what's going on here. That's they're getting ready to have communion. Otherwise, I had no idea what was going on, but in the most wonderful way. It just didn't matter. I was just blown away by the music, which I'd never heard anything like it before, and the aesthetics of the church. And I don't want to make it seem superficial, but I mean, what it really was for me, after thinking about it, after experiencing it, and then leaving, and thinking it was like the Incarnation. The reality of the Incarnation was like really present for me in a way that I had never been before. Right, all four senses, right, of human experience were engaged in worship, and it's not that isn't necessarily present, at least ideally, in Western Christianity, right? But at the same time, the idea that God becoming man unites heaven and earth, right? The material with the immaterial. It was just driven home to me in a way that I never experienced it before, and I just said, I want to go back, and I just kept going, right? And this was during my final year at a Protestant seminary, right? And so I kept that very close to my chest, you know what I mean? And so I just kept going, and I said, I like this. Met my wife And then, she was coming from a completely different background. And so that was a bit of a detour for a short time. And then Orthodoxy, though, just was there. It came back, and that's when I decided that I wanted to do this. So, yeah.
That's really cool.
I think it's a really important distinction. In the West, the atonement is driven.
Yeah.
Theology, liturgy, especially since the Reformation controversy, the Lutheran emphasis on the cross, the cross, right? Not that we shouldn't have an emphasis on the cross. That's not what we're saying, but that to an extent to the detriment of the Incarnation, right?
Yeah.
So what Eastern Christianity, you're right, it just flows out of the Incarnation. So that's why the Transfiguration has so much meaning.
Sure.
And Eastern theology and so forth. Anglicanism is interesting, liturgically. So, like the traditional Book of Common Prayer is very Lutheran in its driving of the atonement and the Eucharistic canon. But by the 17th century, through the High Church Anglican divines, the Incarnation became dominant in Anglican theology. So it's a paradox, right? You have a liturgy that's driven by atonement theology, but the High Church end of Anglicanism is incredibly incarnational and has been since the Caroline Divines in the 17th century.
Right.
So we have this Benedictine spirituality in Anglicanism that isn't conscience in the other Protestant traditions in the West, right? So that's where Anglicanism and Orthodoxy had this touchstone that has been somewhat helpful in conversations.
Yeah, and also too, within Anglicanism in the late 17th century, you had the Cambridge Platonists.
Yes.
Who became very interested in reappropriating a lot of the Greek patristic, the mindset of theosis and deification and.
When you say it crystallized with Michael Ramsey. Great, probably the most significant Archbishop of Canterbury in the 20th century, from 61 to 74. He was the Archbishop. He loved Eastern Orthodoxy and had tremendous relationships with the patriarchs in Orthodoxy. And so he really his persona brought a lot of iconography and all of these things back into Anglicanism. That, again, just has been reassumed as if Anglicans always did these things.
Sure, right.
But actually, if there was an icon in the Anglican Church in the 19th century, they would all fainted.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
But now there's icons everywhere in the Anglican world.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and he wrote a book on the Transfiguration.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a good book.
Yep.
Yep, for sure. Yep. And there's an interesting history there, too, of engagement between the Church of England and the Eastern Church. It goes as far back as the early 17th century.
It does.
It does. When you started to see, for example, an interest on the part of many in the Church of England in order to justify, for example, their own independent existence and their separation and not a need for dependence upon Rome. They went to the East. And then also in the East, because they were under the Ottomans by this point, there was a massive dearth of access to Greek texts, which at the universities in England, Oxford and Cambridge, they had an abundance of.
Right.
And so there was a mutual interest that struck up there.
Right?
Yeah. And so that itself, based purely more on self-interest, of course, on both parts. But nonetheless, it was the beginning of a conversation that took place.
And the power of the British Empire.
Yeah.
And its ability, at least it's being a foil to the Ottomans and to all of these other things.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. And there was a Greek college, even in Oxford, that was established in order to train Orthodox clergy, because in some cases they could not receive proper training under the Ottomans. So they went to the West, which, had mixed products, but, still.
The relationship between Orthodoxy and Anglicanism in the early 20th century was much closer than Anglicanism ever got to reunification with Rome. Anglican orders is the great controversy between Catholicism and Anglicanism. Pope Leo XIII declared Anglican orders were null and void, but the Patriarch Constantinople and recognizing Anglican orders in 1922, and then the ensuing patriarchs, almost all of them, did it in the course of the next decade. There would have been a much better chance of continued fraternity between Anglicanism, at least high church Anglicanism, and Orthodoxy if Anglicanism didn't absolutely lose its mind. Since 1930, Lambeth said birth control was fine, and then the ordination of women, the homosexual issue, and all that. And in Orthodox theology, its economy of salvation, it's not just about this tacit succession of orders. It's about, you have to have the faith.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's a good
it's
point.
It's Cyprianic.
Yeah.
St. Cyprian as opposed to Augustinian, where you just
entirely,
have this tacit succession. So it's a shame that Anglicanism lost its mind.
Yeah. There were points in history, sure, where they came very close. I mean, so close, in fact, that even now in Orthodoxy, there's the existence of what we call the Western Rite.
Right.
Right,
which is basically the Book of Common Prayer with some variation to it.
Yeah. There's some Byzantine emendations to it.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it's essentially what it is, right? Which is interesting. I mean, it's not entirely my cup of tea, but I do see the value in it. But it's a testimony, obviously, to just how close these two different traditions came to interacting with one another and a willingness to interact.
It ain't going to happen now.
Oh no, that's over with. I mean, they still get together and talk and stuff, but it's kind of facile. It's not going anywhere. We have no intention of doing anything. And they're not serious either. Because we know what the issue is. It's even among conservative Anglicans, it's homosexuality is not the issue. The issue is the ordination of women, because there's still conservative Anglicans who have no problem with the ordination of women.
No, you'd have to get into the continuing movements to really have
absolutely
to have any, and they're so small. You don't have enough gravitas, to really.
Right.
It's almost not worth Orthodoxy's energy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I believe that within Orthodoxy there's enough charity and goodwill for us just to talk to anybody who wants to talk.
Yeah.
I mean, there isn't really many people in Orthodoxy whom I'm aware of that would look at the situation in Western churches and say, well, this is their bed, they made it, forget about them. I'm sure there's some people like that, I know there are, but most people I know say, no, let's just be a haven and keep our doors open and say, come talk to us whenever you want. We're happy to help, It's certainly my position personally, so, yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's always hurdles, of course, I don't want to make it seem, like the primrose path, but a lot of that can be fixed just again by having conversations.
Right.
Really, it doesn't have to preclude a lot of things that generally more conservative Christians would be uncomfortable with, like joint prayer services and all that stuff. I mean, we don't do that, obviously, but there's just nothing wrong with talking to someone.
Right.
Exactly.
Conversation has to be based in truth, though, right? So
sure. Yeah.
It has to be a return to sources.
Yeah.
And if that's if that's not going to be one half of the dialogue's goal, then there's no point to the dialogue.
Right.
Right. If it's just going to be, well, let's be diverse and inclusive. Right?
Yeah.
There's a mutable truth that's not about being diverse about, and so there's no sense having a conversation about it. Right.
Yeah. And you can, and there's plenty of context in which you can have very good conversations still with folks, and so, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get into some of those as Nathan gets down his list there a little bit.
Yeah, well, we've answered a lot of the questions, too. It's by no means exhaustive, and I think that conversation, those types of conversations, as with the goal of our conversations on this show, will be ever more important if conservative denominations, let's say, conservative Christian traditions across the ecumenical spectrum look to ally together in defense of Christian moral virtue against the advances of the culture. We'll have to be able to get beyond our preconceived notions or our caricatures about denominations, about churches on the other side of this river or the other river, and be able to reclaim the commonalities of the great tradition, as we've talked about in the previous episode.
You need common cause. You need, if you have a common cause, you're not going to have dialogue about anything.
Exactly.
So if Cory and I were official representatives of two sides of the river, we're not going to start out with the split of 1054 or the clause and then the Nicene Creed. We're going to talk about how we can ally in modern moral issues that are immutable.
Sure.
In the Christian tradition. And then that brings you into closer fraternal relationship that allows you to have these other conversations in charity.
Exactly.
And, but Protestant denominations aren't likely to do that. These other issues have become far more important than these patristic truths that we would hold dear to our hearts.
Right. Yeah. It's true.
I want to turn back to the use of icons. I think if we look at the, say, caricature of orthodoxy that unfamiliar people have in their minds, right? It's the beards, it's the incense, and it's icons. And you mentioned the use of icons, and we know that icons are used in Orthodoxy especially, but also very much in Catholicism and Anglicanism. Can you speak to the importance and the role of icons? Because I think for many, it's just not something that occurs to them, or it may even be, or may certainly be, a topic that is uncomfortable for them to broach.
I would say it's unbiblical.
Or unbiblical.
Sure. Yeah, right. That's always an interesting conversation to have, and it always goes in a host of different directions. I remember a few years back, just to give one example, I was in a Greek parish where I was attending at the time, and Mark had popped by. Remember, we had a festival. That's another thing too. Orthodox love their festivals.
Oh yeah.
We can talk about that maybe later. And so the parish I was in at the time, this festival that they would have once a year, it's a big money draw for them, and obviously it helps keep the parish going. And so a lot of people will attend this, and we'll open up the church and we'll give tours and whatnot. People naturally are interested because they've never seen a church like this before, right? And so they come in, they're initially interested, they're curious, and in some cases, once you start explaining why the church is arranged or organized the way that it is, some people will deepen their interest. Some people will be maybe even a little scandalized. And I remember in one such instance, we had a group of Roman Catholics who were just fascinated by the church. And they sat down and they engaged us in conversation, lay people. And they were from a Catholic parish just down the road, Immaculate Conception. And it was interesting talking to them, right? Because there are all these again, like you said, these caricatures of Eastern Christianity, that they were talking about, and it's like it's its own separate vocabulary in a sense, right? Yeah. And as Orthodox, I can understand it because I came from Western Christianity, so I know what they're saying and why they're saying it, but. Cradle Orthodox, and I don't like using that term because you're not born into the church, you're baptized into it, but they hear that language and they look at me and say, Cory, what are they talking about? What do they mean when they say that, Yes. And so it's interesting to have those conversations. But they were fascinated, they were fascinated with the imagery. And then they would say things like, oh, I miss when, our churches used to look like this, before Vatican II, and, now they just look like civic centers or whatever it may be, Right. And
Deco art.
Right. And I feel for them, of course, because there's a tradition there that was obviously lost. So that's interesting. But then you get some Protestants who come in and then, they say, well, this is pretty. But what is the point of this? I don't understand this.
Why is Jesus on the ceiling?
Right. And what's with Mary? Behind whatever that is up there. I say, that's the altar, and the altar space, and then you have to explain to them the icon screen, and well, what do you do with all these pictures? I said, well, we reverence them. They're not just aesthetics. It's not just decorations.
Could you take a moment to explain the icon screen?
Yeah, sure. The icon screen, or the iconostas. unfortunately, contrary to what many Orthodox might believe, it was not used by the apostles. It was a later development, of course.
I'm hearing that.
It's very similar to the rood screen.
Rood screen, right.
You know, the rood screen like you would see in the medieval churches, and even today, still in some Anglican churches, right? But the only difference being, of course, is that we filled in the spaces with icons, right? And then the icons became a source of reverence and veneration, not because we're venerating the wood, right, or the paint, right, on the artwork, because the adoration and the devotion that we show to the icon, the theology goes to the person that it represents beyond it, right? And again, it goes back to the Incarnation, right? What does Christ do in the Incarnation? He unites the material with the immaterial, right? By becoming man, like true man, right? It's not, he's not a ghost. He's not adopting a body and then leaving it behind as a former shell, right? In the Ascension, he ascends into heaven as fully God and fully man, right?
With a human body.
With a human body, and he still has it now, right? That's
blood, flesh, and bones.
That's right. And so the justification of the icons has always been that, in God becoming man, God is saying that matter matters, right?
Exactly.
The body matters, right?
Greek philosophy matters.
Yes, and in fact, to that point, tomorrow is the Sunday of Orthodoxy in the Orthodox Church, or the Triumph of Orthodoxy, as it's also known. And it's a Sunday where we celebrate the triumph of the ecumenical fathers of the Seventh Ecumenical Council of Nicaea II, which saw the victory of the icons, right, against the iconoclast. And so icons are very important. They're always reverenced when you enter the church. We kiss them, right? Great care is taken when they are created. We don't say that the icons are painted, but they're actually written because they're telling a story.
Well, tell them how they're made. I mean, the layering of it, right?
Yes.
You're really looking.
Talk about that.
You're looking through time and space, even dimension into eternity.
You are, and I'm no expert. And I've always been into art, and I had a little stint in art school, but I gave a little shot into icon writing, and it didn't go so well. But the method behind it is very interesting. There's a canonicity to it, right? Not every icon is simply an icon because it looks like one. There is a method to the creation of an icon. There's a way that it is to be done and a way that it should not be done. And so what you commonly do is you start by a layer of the darkest colors, and then you work on your way from the darkest colors to the light, right? And then you would lay down after the gold leaf that goes behind the image, right? Which also is pretty expensive. I mean, it's an intricate process, and you really have to study it. You go to school, and it's a big deal. I mean, you don't really see it here, but in the old countries, there were whole schools dedicated to training iconographers, right? Because they're the ones who really make the churches come alive when we're building these churches, right? And so icons are very important. They're not optional. There are certain images that cannot be depicted, for example, in icons. For example, canonically, you are not supposed to represent an image of the Father in iconography because no one has ever seen the Father, right? So they
non-corporeal.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they serve the function of always communicating proper dogma, right? Proper doctrine. And that's why they're so important. So, and it's very common, for example, to go into a faithful Orthodox home and see lots of icons, right? They should be there. So the interesting thing is it's fallen out of favor in the West. People forget, and I've had this conversation also with Roman Catholics, people forget that some of the greatest defenders of the icons were themselves the popes. Very early on, if you look at the 7th and the 8th century, many of those who defended the icon against the iconoclasts were popes, right? And so it's something that's fallen into either disuse or just almost myth, in a sense, right, or a legend, and been replaced by statues.
Yeah, right. It became part of the political diatribe.
Yeah.
Statuary and icons.
Yes, right.
Between East and West. And,
Yep.
Yeah, definitely. I think about, Cory, when I've talked about this for decades, and with some of our Protestant evangelical brethren, their reasons they would disagree or even reject.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But at the same time, you're talking about people that have pictures of their families all over their walls.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And they kiss grandma's picture because they want to remember grandma. And there's, if you go to the headstone, there's carved into it this relief of grandpa on his, John Deere tractor, and all those things. But this inability to connect logically.
Yeah. Well, they'll put mangers in their front yard, and
Right, but an icon which goes back to antiquity in the Christian church,
Yeah.
is representative of God becoming man, is outside of the bounds, right? And so
Right.
we're so stuck in like cultural prejudice about things in the Protestant West about
Yeah.
so much of this stuff that again, Anglicanism got lucky in a sense. Because of the nature of architecture inheriting the medieval churches, that idea of, and it didn't get totally gutted of its femininity because of Marian feasts
Sure.
that remained in the prayer book and so forth. And so the Incarnation couldn't help but seep its way back through Anglican worship. And so, as opposed to the Kirk and the whole Reformed Presbyterian.
There's one stained glass window in the whole of Scotland, I heard, or something
Right,
like
so
that.
you need a whitewashed church
Yeah.
and so forth. It's very difficult after centuries of that to make
Yeah.
this retransition to the historicity of beauty, right?
Yeah.
The beauty of Christian worship.
Yes.
Worship the Lord in holiness and beauty.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
It is. And sometimes when you have conversations about iconography or just church aesthetics, modern practice and modern custom in Western churches, sort of becomes, the foundation for the conversation, and they forget about the Middle Ages and Gothic cathedrals and whatnot, and what they were trying to communicate, right, with architecture and. Which is interesting because, in the Gothic churches, right, they give you a very specific understanding of God, right? Because if you've been inside a Gothic church, you have these ceilings that are just huge and they go so far up, it's like you're trying to touch the sky, right?
It's in cruciform shape.
Yeah, right.
It's all designed with a purpose.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's saying something about who God is. And then by contrast, you would look at Byzantine architecture and it's just the opposite. Everything is very low. Right, it's very much right there because you're supposed to be able to touch
it.
God, right, and participate in God, and so it's very interesting. But that's something again that's just lost nowadays. They don't take that into consideration, right? Which is regrettable because it's not because your aesthetics are necessarily wrong, right? What's more dangerous, in my opinion, is that it's telling me that there might be something defunct with your understanding of the Incarnation. That's the problem.
Absolutely.
That's the real problem. So, yeah.
We've both worked on that, sermons and some writings in the last several months about the incalculable importance of the Incarnation.
Yeah.
Without the Incarnation, you can't get to the cross.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
You can't get to Pentecost. You certainly can't get to the Ascension.
Yeah.
Right? And so, again, this systematic ability to do theology in the context of Orthodox Christology
Yes.
is such a challenge
Yeah.
for the West.
The whole, the Orthodox, when it says that the whole life of Christ, right, is a work of God uniting man, right? It's not singularly focused, for example, on atonement or the cross, right? And speaking, Orthodox and Roman Catholics, they can meet somewhere on that, but you're trying to speak to most Protestants, right? It's lost on them because they're so atonement driven, and there's a very specific understanding of atonement, right? It's substitutionary theory, which isn't in the Orthodox Church, and we don't believe in penal substitution. So
A bunch of people just fainted,
probably wasn't my intention to hurt anyone, but yeah. So it's a huge difference, right? And it's also connected to, well, why does God become man?
Right.
God, Orthodox don't agree, for example, with Anselm on why God became man.
Oh, no.
Right. So
No, that's why I'm here to tell you you're crazy.
yeah, right. So
Arguing Archbishop of Canterbury, a sainted Archbishop
right.
of Canterbury.
So yeah, there's differences there.
But I think of
don't know.
Irenaeus' great line, about that, which so connects us to the Orthodox understanding of incarnation. The glory of God is the living man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is really about human beings become not something otherworldly. It's about human beings truly becoming human.
It's interesting,
Right.
you know, when Archbishop
Exactly.
Ramsey he's buried in Canterbury Cathedral, and you know, all these great prelates can put anything they want on their tomb. That's the only thing you put on there.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's on his gravestone.
Quote from Aaron.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
That's right. Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, the glory of God is a man truly
That's so
alive.
cool.
Yeah.
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 Glory
It
of
says
the
a lot.
Incarnation.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to take a break, and we'll finish up the rest of our questions when we get back.
Super.
Cool.
Guess what? We were having such a great conversation that we had to split it into 2 episodes. Thank you so much for listening. By the way, we would love to stay in touch with you. Why not click the link in the description and join our email list? We'll send you occasional emails about new episodes and other important updates. We look forward to seeing you next time. God bless.